Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Fred and George Weasley, perhaps the most charismatic and charming jokesters of Hogwarts. Their energy, charm, and endless sense of humor became one of the brightest colors in the entire Harry Potter story. But behind the loud laughter and fireworks of fun lies something far more complex. Today, let's take a look at the darker side of the Weasley twins and figure out why not everything about their behavior is as harmless as it seems. Enjoy watching. Number 1, they're terrible brothers. Let's start with the personal. Even though the Weasley family has always been portrayed as close-knit, Fred and George are far from perfect older brothers. Ron, the youngest son, constantly lived in their shadow. Instead of support, he received mockery, humiliation, and, quite literally, psychological trauma. They were the ones who caused his arachnophobia by pranking him with a spider when he was a child. The twins never helped Ron feel confident or believe in himself. They laughed at his insecurities, ignored his achievements, and even gave the Marauder's map to Harry instead of their own brother. If Ron's life at Hogwarts might have been easier without them, that already says a lot. Number 2, they lack empathy. The Weasley twins could make anyone laugh, but understanding others was not their strong suit. What mattered to them was the laughter, not the feelings of the person who became the target of their joke. Hermione often pointed out the inappropriateness of their pranks, but they would just shrug it off, claiming she simply had no sense of humor. A joke for laughter's sake is one thing, but if it causes pain, humiliation, or makes someone a laughingstock, that's something else entirely. And Fred and George crossed that line more than once. Number 3, they can be cruel. Many fans of the series would agree that Fred and George are the life of the party. But sometimes their humor had openly cruel undertones. Their frequent targets included Slytherin students, their own siblings, and sometimes even random first years. Remember when they booed a Slytherin just for belonging to the house, or the infamous prank on Ron that left him with a lifelong fear of spiders? Even if their jokes weren't meant to be malicious, they sometimes turned into outright bullying. Number 4, their business is ethically questionable. When Fred and George opened their own joke shop, many cheered. Finally, they found a way to use their talent. But, let's be honest, not all of their inventions were harmless. Love potions, for instance, are deeply concerning. Selling such brews is a dubious idea, since they can easily be used with ill intent. Harry had to stay alert more than once to avoid falling under their effects. If Romilda Vane had succeeded, part of the blame would have fallen on the twins. After all, they were the suppliers. Sure, love potions existed before them, but that doesn't excuse it. Their business, as entertaining as it may seem, still flirts with ethical boundaries. Number 5, they lack discipline. Fred and George were the embodiment of anarchy in school robes. They broke Hogwarts rules with such ease that it seemed almost part of the curriculum, and yet they managed to avoid serious punishment thanks to their Quidditch talent and natural charm that disarmed even the strictest teachers. Ironically, the only person who truly managed to rein them in, at least a little, was Dolores Umbridge, a character who is anything but admirable. Number 6, they have dark tendencies. At the heart of many of Fred and George's jokes lies the pleasure of seeing someone feel awkward or uncomfortable. That kind of humor isn't for everyone. It's not based on wit, but on the victim's reaction. The more they squirm, the funnier it is. Borders on mild sadism. Playful or not, it's there. Perhaps that's why some readers and viewers see in their antics not harmless fun, but a disturbing streak of cruelty. Number 7, they're not as funny as they seem. Finally, let's admit it, humor is subjective. For some, Fred and George are a source of endless laughter. For others, persistent pranksters whose every joke feels like a repeat of the last. Some fans noted that with each book, their humor lost its spark, becoming more of a habit than a talent. Yes, they added lightness to the story, but if you take away the jokes, you might realize the brothers aren't as indispensable as we've been led to believe. Number 8. They neglect the safety of others. Fred and George Weasley loved spectacle, explosions, smoke, chaos. Their fireworks were famous across Hogwarts, but fame often came with danger. During one of their test runs in the Great Hall, a firework shot off in the wrong direction, nearly setting a tapestry ablaze. Students ducked under tables as sparks rained down. Professor Flitwick had to extinguish the flames himself, muttering, "Brilliant craftsmanship in my terrible judgment." The twins, of course, laughed. They were proud of the reaction, not aware of how close they'd come to real disaster. Their inventions sometimes went even further. The skiving snack boxes, candies that made you vomit or faint, were meant for skipping class, but a younger student, Nigel, once tried one without knowing the dosage. He collapsed in the hallway. Madame Pomfrey rushed him to the hospital wing, furious. "If this is your idea of fun," she told them, "you'll end up with a body count." Yet even that didn't stop them. Fred and George treated magic like a toy, not a force that demanded caution. Their brilliance was undeniable, but their carelessness made every laugh echo with risk. Number 9. They don't respect authority. Fred and George Weasley never feared authority. They mocked it. Long before Dolores Umbridge arrived, they treated Hogwarts rules as suggestions, not laws. When Professor McGonagall caught them enchanting snowballs to hit Professor Quirrell's turban, she didn't know they were actually pelting Voldemort's host. She only saw 2 laughing boys. "Detention, both of you," she said sharply, but they left grinning, already planning their next stunt. To them, punishment was part of the fun. The idea that rules could exist for safety, not control, never truly sank in. Their defiance reached its peak with Umbridge. When she imposed her cruel decrees, the twins' rebellion became legendary. Fireworks in classrooms, enchanted swamps, mocking messages on the walls. Students cheered, teachers secretly smiled. Yet behind the applause was a darker truth. Fred and George weren't fighting for justice, but for freedom from any authority at all. Even McGonagall's attempts to guide them were met with sarcasm. "You know, Professor," Fred once said, "you'd have done the same if you'd had a sense of humor." Their laughter silenced the moment, but it also showed how rebellion without respect turns courage into arrogance. Number 10. They don't think about the consequences. Fred and George Weasley lived for the thrill of the moment. Planning was boring, excitement was everything. When Professor Umbridge tried to tighten her grip on Hogwarts, the twins responded with chaos. Fireworks that roared like dragons, enchanted Catherine wheels that chased students down corridors. The Great Hall filled with smoke and laughter. It was glorious, until a firework nearly hit a first year. "You two just made history," Lee Jordan shouted. But history, as McGonagall knew, sometimes leaves burns. Their decision to leave school was no different. As Fred turned to the crowd and called, "Give a hell from us, Peeves!" It felt like a triumph, yet behind the applause there was a quieter truth. They didn't think about the exams they'd abandoned or the message they sent to younger students. That defiance was better than endurance. For every student they inspired, another learned that rules were meaningless, that rebellion was always the right answer. It was a moment of power, but not of wisdom. Luck saved them more than foresight ever did. Their shop in Diagon Alley became a success, but it could just as easily have failed. Their brilliance was undeniable, yet their carelessness followed them like a shadow. They never stopped to ask what came after the laughter or who cleaned up the mess when the fun was over. For Fred and George, the future was always tomorrow's problem, until one of them never saw tomorrow at all. Number 11. They abuse their magical abilities. Fred and George Weasley were gifted wizards, far more talented than they ever admitted. They could invent, enchant, and improvise faster than most students in their year, but instead of channeling that gift into something meaningful, they used it to make chaos sparkle. Their joke products, skiving snack boxes, Tun-Tung toffees, and portable swamps, weren't harmless fun. As Hermione once said with exasperation, "You could have been top of your class if you'd applied yourselves properly." The twins just laughed, proud of the mischief rather than the mastery behind it. One of their earliest experiments went too far. When Dudley Dursley tried one of their Tun-Tung toffees, his tongue grew 3 feet long. Molly Weasley's fury was immediate. "Really?" she shouted. "You could have killed him." But Fred and George only shrugged. To them it was a prank. Clever, yes, but also reckless. They didn't think about the line between skill and cruelty, between invention and irresponsibility. Their magic, though brilliant, became a tool of mockery, not creation. Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, later showcased hundreds of magical products. Fireworks that exploded like dragons, candies that made you faint, hats that removed your head from sight. Spectacular, yes. But each item was a reminder of how power, without restraint, turns dangerous. Fred and George never truly grasped that magic carries weight. It can heal or harm, protect or humiliate. And too often their wands chose the latter, not out of malice, but out of a boyish refusal to grow up. Number 12. They don't respect other people's work. Fred and George Weasley loved to laugh, but too often their laughter came at someone else's expense. For them, nothing was too sacred for a joke. Schoolwork, rules, even people's efforts. Hermione Granger became one of their favourite targets. When she spent nights perfecting her essays or worrying about exams, they rolled their eyes and called her the Minister for Homework. "Lighten up, Hermione," Fred once teased, while she frowned over her arithmancy notes. But behind her irritation was something deeper. The sting of knowing her hard work was never taken seriously. Their mockery extended to Percy, the brother they called Perfect Prefect Percy. Percy was proud, ambitious, and obsessed with order. Traits easy to ridicule for two boys who thrived on chaos. When Percy earned a badge or praise from a teacher, Fred and George never missed the chance to turn it into a joke. "How's the ministry treating you, Mr. Weasley?" They'd laugh long before he actually joined it. What they saw as harmless fun slowly drove a wedge between them. Their laughter made Percy's dedication look foolish, and eventually he stopped trying to connect with them at all. Even Ron felt the sharp edge of their humour. When he became a prefect in Order of the Phoenix, his brothers reacted not with pride, but with mock applause. "Well, who'd have thought it?" Fred said with a grin. "Ronnie the prefect!" The joke stung, even if Ron pretended to laugh. In that moment, the message was clear. Hard work wasn't cool. Being clever and carefree was. The twins never realized that their jokes were quietly teaching others to belittle effort, to sneer at those who tried too hard. Laughter was their weapon and their shield, but it often left scars they didn't see. They believed they were spreading joy, when in truth they sometimes spread discouragement. The Weasley twins were geniuses in magic, but blind when it came to empathy. They never understood that every laugh at someone's effort chips away at respect, both for others and for themselves. Number 13, they are a bad example to follow. At first glance, Fred and George Weasley seemed like the perfect role model, bold, funny, and fearless. Every student at Hogwarts admired their confidence. They made chaos look charming. But beneath that charm was a dangerous message. Rules don't matter if you can make people laugh. When Professor McGonagall caught them turning a hallway into a swamp, she sighed, "You two are the limit." Even she, who secretly admired their wit, knew that their defiance taught others to rebel without thinking. Younger students copied them. Dennis Creevey once tried to sneak a trick sweet into class, proudly saying, "It's a Weasley wheeze." For him, mischief meant courage, because Fred and George made it look that way. Yet behind every laugh was the lesson that breaking rules could earn applause. Their jokes weren't just about fun, they shaped the atmosphere at school. Respect for teachers faded when laughter became the only thing that mattered. Even Ron, their younger brother, felt the shadow of their influence. He admired them, but he also feared becoming a joke himself. "You two are unbelievable," he once said, half in awe, half in frustration. Their charisma made rebellion seem noble, but Ron's constant struggle to be taken seriously showed how destructive that image could be. Fred and George didn't mean harm, laughable, but they taught by example that cleverness outweighed kindness and mockery was a sign of strength. Their story is a reminder that influence doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from laughter. The twins never stopped to think that every prank, every smirk, every careless word built an unspoken standard for others. They didn't intend to lead, but they did. And their leadership, though bright and funny, often led others away from empathy and respect. In the end, even heroes can be bad examples when they forget how easily others are watching. Number 14, they are selfish toward their parents. Molly and Arthur Weasley gave everything they could to their children: love, warmth, and patience, even when money was short and life was never easy. Yet Fred and George often acted as if that wasn't enough. They turned worry into a joke and rules into a challenge. When Molly scolded them for their dangerous tricks, they only laughed. "Mum's going to kill us," George once said with a grin. But the truth was, she was terrified for them. Her laughter was nervous, not joyful. Their rebellion reached its peak when they dropped out of Hogwarts. No warning, no explanation, just a grand exit in a blaze of fireworks, leaving behind chaos and a broken-hearted mother. Arthur tried to defend them, but Molly's voice trembled. "You could have been killed." For her, it wasn't about the rules, it was about losing her sons to recklessness. The family, already living on the edge, suddenly felt the sting of disappointment, not because the twins failed, but because they never seemed to care how deeply their choices cut. Even their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, began as a point of pain. The idea of turning pranks into profit felt like another childish whim. Molly begged them to think of their futures of stability. But Fred and George brushed it off. "We've got a plan, Mum," they said, eyes gleaming with mischief. Only later, when the business thrived, did she smile with pride. Yet that first night after they left, she cried herself to sleep. Fred and George never meant to hurt their parents, but they were too caught up in their own brilliance to see the cost. Their success came from courage and talent, yes, but also from a streak of selfishness. They forgot that every bold leap they took left someone behind worrying. In a family built on love, that was their cruelest joke. Number 15, they violate personal boundaries. Fred and George Weasley were the heart of mischief at Hogwarts, the sparks that turned even the dullest corridor into a stage for laughter and chaos. Yet beneath their dazzling humour and infectious charm, there existed a subtle problem that few dared to confront: the way they blurred the line between fun and intrusion. For the twins, the world seemed like one endless playground where boundaries were optional and privacy was just another joke waiting to be told. Their laughter, so loud and genuine, often drowned out the discomfort of others who found themselves unwilling participants in their games. What made them endearing was also what made them dangerous: their inability to see when a laugh became an invasion. It began innocently enough, as all mischief does. Their pranks were creative, even brilliant: sweets that turned your tongue blue, fireworks that painted the sky with dragons, trick wands that turned into rubber chickens. But their need to entertain often came at someone else's expense. When they slipped a Tun-Tung toffee to Dudley Dursley in Goblet of Fire, the result was horrifying. Dudley's tongue grew several feet long, flopping helplessly as Mrs. Dursley screamed. Fred and George found it hilarious. Harry didn't. The twins didn't see a terrified boy. They saw comedy. This was their blind spot. They never quite measured how deeply their harmless fun could cut. At Hogwarts, their victims were not always bullies or rule breakers. Sometimes they were simply students who had the misfortune of being nearby. Lee Jordan once laughed himself breathless when Fred transfigured a Slytherin's bag into a squealing pig. But not everyone shared that joy. Even Hermione, who tolerated their antics more than most, reached her limit. When they tested their skiving snack boxes on younger students, she snapped that they were using first years as test subjects. Fred only grinned, saying, "It's for the greater good of comedy." In those words was a glimpse of their world-view: that laughter justified everything. To them, embarrassment was temporary, laughter eternal. Fred and George did not only disrupt the ordinary, they invaded it. They burst into rooms unannounced, overheard secrets, and treated the personal lives of others as raw material for entertainment. Once, they teased Ron mercilessly about his crushes, waving imaginary love letters and making him blush crimson. Their mother, Molly Weasley, scolded them for their cruelty, but they brushed it off with their usual refrain: "He'll thank us later." Yet the truth was that Ron never did. Their constant mockery of his insecurities, his hand-me-downs, his fear of spiders, his awkwardness, left marks invisible but lasting. It wasn't malice, but neglect. They never stopped to ask whether their brother laughed with them or in spite of them. Hermione Granger, the voice of reason in their circle, often stood as their moral mirror. She found them brilliant but irresponsible. When they sold love potions that blurred consent and emotions, she warned them sharply. "You're playing with something dangerous?" They ignored her. Fred joked that love and laughter go hand in hand. But Hermione understood what they refused to see. Some emotions are sacred. To toy with them is not humor, but harm. Years later, when their joke products filled the shelves of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, she could still recall those moments when their humor crossed into violation. Their disregard for privacy was not limited to people's emotions. It extended to their personal space. Once, Ginny found them rummaging through her drawers in search of what they called explosive inspiration. She threw a hex at them, furious. To the twins, this was proof of her growing temper, not her rightful anger. It was a pattern. Every protest was dismissed as an overreaction, every boundary as a lack of humor. "Can't you take a joke?" was their shield, their excuse, their absolution. But humour ceases to be innocent when it becomes a weapon to silence discomfort. Even Harry Potter, their closest ally, sometimes felt uneasy. Fred and George adored him like a younger brother, but they also treated his privacy lightly. They once read his mail aloud at breakfast, turning Sirius's carefully written advice into public spectacle. Harry laughed along, embarrassed but unwilling to show it. In truth, he was torn. He loved them, but he also felt exposed. The letter had been personal, a rare moment of connection with someone who understood his isolation. When Fred mimicked Sirius's words for a laugh, Harry's smile faded quickly. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet ache, the kind that follows when trust is treated as a toy. The line between laughter and cruelty is often thin, and the twins danced dangerously close to it. During the Yule Ball, when Hermione appeared transformed in her periwinkle blue dress, Fred's teasing words to Ron, "You'd better get a move on before someone else does," seemed harmless. But afterward they mocked her new elegance, joking that she must have used Polyjuice potion. For Hermione, who had spent years dismissed as bookish and plain, it hurt. Fred didn't notice. He was already laughing at something else. To them, teasing was affection, but to others, it was a reminder of how easily the twins could turn warmth into ridicule. Fred and George were not cruel by nature. They were careless. Their laughter was their armor against fear, their rebellion against a world that often seemed too serious, too cruel. During the war, their humor became a lifeline for many, but even in darker times, the habits of mockery persisted. They couldn't resist pranking Percy when he tried to warn them about ministry regulations, painting a P on his back and calling him the ministry's pet owl. Percy didn't laugh. Years later, when Fred was gone, George would perhaps remember that moment differently, realizing too late that not all wounds are healed with humor. Number 16, they can't take criticism. Fred and George Weasley, the inseparable twins of the Harry Potter universe, built their reputation on laughter. From their first appearance at the Burrow to the halls of Hogwarts, their wit and humor seemed unstoppable. They made jokes in the darkest times, brought color into chaos, and gave the world Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a shop filled with enchanted jokes, pranks, and chaos in bottles. But behind this sparkling brilliance lies a truth that many fans overlook. Fred and George could mock anyone except themselves. When someone dared to criticize their actions, their humor became a shield. It was not just comedy, it was armor against self-reflection. The twin brothers were masters of deflection. Every sarcastic remark was a sword, every smirk a wall. When they were students, teachers constantly reprimanded them for their pranks, but instead of reflecting, they responded with smirks and laughter. Professor McGonagall's stern words never truly reached them. They brushed off her reprimands with an air of superiority. This was not confidence, it was avoidance. They could endure detentions and house points lost, but the moment someone questioned their judgment or ethics, the laughter grew louder. Fred and George did not mock because they didn't care. They mocked because caring would have required vulnerability. One of the most striking examples of their inability to accept criticism came during the 6th book, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. By this point, the twins had left Hogwarts and opened their joke shop in Diagon Alley. Their success was undeniable, and even Hermione Granger, who often rolled her eyes at their mischief, admitted they had talent. But her concern over the safety of their products was genuine. When she warned them about the potential dangers of certain items, particularly love potions and dangerous prank gadgets, the twins laughed her off. Hermione, who represented logic and caution, saw what they didn't: the thin line between mischief and harm. When Hermione mentioned that their love potions could be dangerous, George joked that if someone took one by accident, they'd just have to enjoy the attention. To the twins it was hilarious, to Hermione it was reckless. She reminded them that love potions were banned in most circumstances and could cause obsession or irrational behavior. Their response was not dialogue but dismissal. Instead of considering her point, they turned it into a joke, teasing her about her perfect prefect attitude. They never admitted that she might be right. And she was right. Later in the same book, Ron Weasley accidentally consumed a love potion meant for someone else and had to be taken to Professor Slughorn for an antidote. The twins' laughter had blinded them to the consequences of their own creations. Fred and George's refusal to accept criticism was part of their charm, but also part of their flaw. Their humor was their strength, but it also became their prison. When Molly Weasley worried about the risk of leaving school to open a business, the twins made light of it, calling her fears maternal overreaction. They failed to see that behind her worry was love and genuine concern for their safety. To them, every serious conversation was an invitation for sarcasm, yet the more they joked, the less they listened. Their dynamic with Hermione was perhaps the clearest mirror of this flaw. She was everything they were not, studious, rule-abiding, and careful. When she voiced her concerns, it was never out of malice. It was because she cared about ethics and responsibility. But the twins saw her seriousness as an attack on their identity. Instead of reflecting, they teased. When she scolded them about selling dangerous items to first years, they brushed it off, joking that every young wizard needs a good scare. It wasn't just a lack of maturity, it was fear of being seen as wrong. The twins' entire world was built on being cleverer than everyone else, and accepting criticism threatened that illusion. The irony is that Fred and George were not cruel people. They were generous, brave, and full of spirit. But humor, when used as armor, distorts perception. Their constant need to laugh things off came from a deeper fear, the fear of not being taken seriously if they ever showed humility. They were the funny ones in the Weasley family, overshadowed by Percy's ambition, Bill's success, and Charlie's adventurous spirit. Their jokes were their rebellion, their way of standing out. So when someone criticized them, they didn't hear reason, they heard rejection. There is a moment in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix that reveals how deep this pattern ran. During their final months at Hogwarts, as Dolores Umbridge's tyranny grew, the twins escalated their pranks, turning the school into a theatre of chaos. Their grand exit, fireworks exploding in the corridors, swamps forming in hallways, was legendary. Students cheered and Fred's grin was triumphant. But beneath the spectacle lay something telling. They never stopped to consider that their rebellion, while brave, also created fear and disruption. They didn't want to hear it. They thrived on applause and dismissed any suggestion that they might have crossed a line. When Hermione remarked that their stunts could get them expelled or worse, they ignored her entirely. They had built a persona too strong to question. This inability to face critique became a quiet tragedy in their story. When the war against Voldemort began, the twins' shop flourished, but so did the dangers surrounding them. Their inventive minds could have been an incredible force for the Order of the Phoenix, yet their insistence on independence often made cooperation difficult. They distrusted authority, even when authority was necessary. Their jokes about the ministry's failures, though justified, also masked their discomfort with responsibility. It was easier to make fun of corruption than to engage in the uncomfortable work of changing it. Number 17. They lack gratitude. Fred and George Weasley were the twin comets of the wizarding world, brilliant, reckless, dazzling, and impossible to ignore. Their laughter filled every corner of the burrow, their pranks defined the spirit of Hogwarts, and their name became synonymous with mischief. Yet beneath the glow of their fireworks and the sparkle of their inventions lies a quiet truth often overlooked by admirers of their humour and genius. For all their charm and wit, Fred and George struggled with something deeply human: gratitude. They could give the world laughter, but they rarely gave it thanks. The Weasleys were not a wealthy family. Every meal, every pair of robes, every second-hand book came from sacrifice and patience. Molly Weasley stretched every galleon to feed 7 children, while Arthur's modest job at the ministry barely kept them afloat. Ron's embarrassment over hand-me-downs and Ginny's patched robes were not exaggerations. They were reminders of how much love held that family together. Each Weasley child understood it in their own way. Bill worked hard at Gringotts. Charlie devoted himself to dragons instead of comfort. Percy sought prestige to bring pride to the family, and Ron felt it through quiet shame. But Fred and George, though they loved their family, seemed to dance through life untouched by the weight of gratitude. They laughed at the family's struggles, not out of cruelty, but because they refused to be bound by them. When the twins dropped out of Hogwarts, they did so with flair. Their grand escape, fireworks exploding, swamp flooding the corridor, and Umbridge humiliated, became a legendary act of rebellion. Students cheered, and Harry, standing amid the chaos, admired them. Yet what few noticed was that Fred and George left school not only without permission, but also without fully realizing what they were leaving behind. Their mother's worry, their father's disappointment, their younger siblings' confusion, all were buried under applause. Their defiance was celebrated, but their disregard for the people who had given them everything went quietly unnoticed. When they opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley, it became an instant success. The shop was filled with laughter, colour, and the sweet scent of victory. Yet that triumph had a foundation not built solely on their wit or determination, but on Harry Potter's generosity. "Take it," Harry had said, pressing his Triwizard Tournament winnings into their hands. "You'll need it more than I do." It was 1,000 galleons, a small fortune, and a lifeline for 2 dreamers who had nothing but sketches and ambition. It was an extraordinary act of friendship and faith. But as the years went on, Harry never once heard a heartfelt thank you. Of course, the twins were not unkind. They were loyal to Harry, they fought beside him, and they risked their lives in the Battle of Hogwarts. Yet gratitude is not about repayment, it's about recognition. Fred and George often acted as though the world owed them a stage for their brilliance. They never considered that their ability to shine had been made possible by those who quietly stood behind them. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Molly Weasley scolds them for their attitude. Just because you're allowed to use magic now doesn't mean you have to whip your wands out for everything. They laugh, brushing off her concern. It is this pattern, charming disregard, that defines much of their story. There was a moment when gratitude might have revealed itself. After their shop's success, Fred and George returned home during Christmas holidays, arms full of gifts and jokes. They filled the burrow with laughter once again. Molly smiled, but her eyes were tired. For her, the twins' triumph was both a joy and a wound. She had feared for their future, and they had proved her wrong. Yet they never truly said the words that mattered. A simple, "Thank you for believing in us," or even, "We know we made it hard," would have meant the world to her. Instead, they gave her enchanted knitting needles that sang Christmas carols, clever, funny, and entirely in character, but not heartfelt. Fred and George's relationship with Harry also showed this emotional blind spot. They adored him, teased him, and stood by him. When he gave them the Marauder's map, their respect was clear, but even then they turned it into another tool for mischief. Their affection for Harry was real, yet their way of expressing gratitude was through humour, not humility. After all, these were the same boys who once tested their joke suites on first-year students, laughing as chaos ensued. For them, life was an endless joke, and in that laughter the quiet language of thankfulness got lost. Harry himself never demanded appreciation. He was used to giving without expecting much in return. He had known neglect too well to measure love through words of thanks, but to the reader it's hard not to notice the imbalance. Fred and George's success story is one of the most joyful in the series, but it is also one of the most unacknowledged debts. Without Harry's gift, their dream would have remained a fantasy scribbled on parchment. They might have still made it one day, perhaps, but not when they did, not with such brilliance. Gratitude would not have cost them their pride, it would have deepened their humanity. Number 18, Fred and George Weasley ignore the morality of their inventions. Fred and George Weasley were, without question, two of the most brilliant inventors Hogwarts had ever seen. Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, stood on Diagon Alley, like a beacon of laughter and rebellion. Its windows shimmered with dancing fireworks, the air around it filled with floating soap bubbles that sang ridiculous songs. Inside, the shelves were crowded with skiving snack boxes, trick wands, puking pastilles, and love potions strong enough to confuse even the sharpest mind. But behind the charm and laughter lay something darker, an unspoken moral dilemma that neither Fred nor George seemed willing to face. Their inventions, as amusing as they were, ignored one essential truth: magic, like humour, has consequences. Their brilliance was never in question. Fred and George had been inventors long before they left Hogwarts. During their school years, they experimented with spells that bent the rules of magic, testing boundaries as if rules existed solely to be broken. They sold magical pranks to younger students and even slipped some to unsuspecting professors. Their laughter often echoed in the corridors, yet not everyone was laughing with them. When Dolores Umbridge took control of Hogwarts, their final fireworks display against her tyranny became legendary. But even in that moment of rebellion, the ethical question lingered. Did they understand that their inventions could harm, not just humiliate? Their laughter was loud enough to drown out doubt, and so they moved forward, unchecked and unreflective. The problem was not mischief itself, but the power of mischief turned into business. In Half-Blood Prince, when Harry entered their shop, he marvelled at how successful they had become. "You've really done it, haven't you?" he said, amazed at the wealth of products and the constant flow of customers. But among the colourful displays were items that raised eyebrows. Peruvian instant darkness powder, for example, a tool so effective that later even Death Eaters used it during the Battle of Hogwarts. Fred and George created something that could blind entire rooms within seconds, allowing chaos to unfold unseen. It was clever, but was it right? They never asked. The powder was a bestseller, and in a world that rewarded cleverness more than conscience, it seemed that the twins had chosen profit over principle. Their skiving snack boxes were another moral grey zone. On the surface, they were hilarious. Sweets that could make a student vomit, faint, or bleed from the nose just long enough to skip class. But the idea of self-inflicted illness as entertainment or convenience revealed a troubling indifference. The twins sold these items to children barely old enough to grasp the risks. One can imagine a young first year consuming too many of the candies, unaware of the side effects. Fred and George never considered this. To them, the laughter of their peers justified everything. "Can't see the point of working hard if you never get to have a bit of fun," George once said. Fun was their compass, and the consequences of that fun were someone else's problem. It wasn't that Fred and George were cruel. They were, at heart, good-natured boys who adored their family and fought bravely in the war against Voldemort. But morality is not only tested in grand battles. It is tested in small, everyday choices. When they brewed potions that could deceive, when they enchanted objects to mislead, they opened doors for misuse. Take, for instance, their line of love potions. In Half-Blood Prince, Romilda Vane's attempt to use one on Harry nearly ended in disaster when Ron accidentally consumed it. The potion's effect was so overpowering that Slughorn had to administer an antidote immediately. This was a moment of near tragedy disguised as humour. The Weasley twins had transformed something as sacred as affection into chemical manipulation and sold it to teenagers. Fred and George's disregard for moral responsibility wasn't born of malice, but of detachment. They viewed their creations as jokes detached from reality, but reality had a way of catching up. When students began experimenting recklessly, the twins shrugged it off. Their shop had become a symbol of freedom, especially after the suffocating rule of Umbridge, but freedom without boundaries is chaos. The laughter that once felt liberating started to sound like an echo of something careless. The moral question stood unanswered. Is a joke still innocent if someone else gets hurt? Even their joke products for self-defense carried dangerous undertones. Decoy detonators, for instance, were clever little devices that created distractions by exploding noisily and releasing smoke. In Deathly Hallows, Harry used one to escape from the Ministry of Magic. The device saved lives that day, yet, in another's hands, the same item could be used to harm or terrorize. The twins sold them openly to anyone with the gold to pay. It was as if their moral compass depended entirely on who used their products, not on what the products themselves represented. Responsibility to them was an abstract idea, something for adults or ministry officials, not for the artists of mischief. When one thinks of the Weasleys, morality and warmth come to mind. Arthur's fascination with Muggle inventions stemmed from curiosity, not profit. Molly's strictness came from love, not control. But Fred and George were anomalies in that family, brilliant, daring, but dangerously unconcerned with consequence. They didn't inherit their father's moral curiosity or their mother's sense of right and wrong. Their world was a carnival, and in a carnival all that matters is that the crowd keeps laughing. Even Harry, who admired them deeply, seemed uneasy at times. Their inventions were dazzling, yes, but as Dumbledore once said, it is our choices that show what we truly are. The twins chose laughter over reflection. Consider the antidote to uncommon poisons, something the twins never bothered to sell or promote, despite creating dozens of potentially toxic items. It was never part of their display, never a bestseller. They made people sick, but rarely made them well. Their shop wasn't balanced between fun and safety. It leaned entirely toward spectacle. When Fred died in the Battle of Hogwarts, some fans romanticized his legacy, the Joker who made the dark times brighter. Yet his death also symbolized something unspoken, the end of innocence in mischief. What was once harmless fun was revealed to have real-world weight. George's silence after the war spoke louder than any explosion from their shop ever could. In the chaos of war, the twins' inventions blurred the line between joke and weapon. Their Peruvian darkness powder aided both sides. Their fireworks, designed for school pranks, became tools of distraction against Death Eaters. Ironically, the same creativity that once entertained Hogwarts became a necessity in battle. But moral intent cannot be rewritten by circumstance. What was made for profit became, by accident, a tool of survival. Their lack of moral foresight had created instruments of chaos, adaptable to both comedy and tragedy, an accidental reflection of the war itself. When Fred and George mocked Percy for his rule-following nature, they failed to see that structure and morality are not enemies of freedom. Percy's rigidity was excessive, but it came from a place of ethical clarity. Fred and George's brilliance might have reached new heights had they combined it with even a fraction of Percy's moral awareness, but to them ethics were boring, humourless and slow. And in the fast world of business, laughter sold better than conscience. Their slogan could have been, "Why ask if it's wrong when it's so much fun?" Their moral blindness also reflected a larger issue within the wizarding world, the normalization of mischief without consequence. Hogwarts itself celebrated cleverness more than compassion. The Marauder's Map, another tool of questionable ethics, inspired the twins. But even that invention by James Potter and his friends had a similar flaw. It was brilliant, invasive, and irresponsible. Fred and George carried on that legacy, making humour a form of power. In doing so, they unknowingly perpetuated the same moral oversight their heroes once committed. If Fred and George had lived in the Muggle world, their inventions might have required regulations, ethical reviews, and safety warnings. But in the wizarding world, laughter was license. They ignored the potential harm because the Ministry ignored it too. The magical economy valued innovation, not integrity. As long as their products didn't directly break laws, morality remained optional. Their shop stood as proof that in a world obsessed with survival and spectacle, ethics could easily be turned into a joke. After the war, George rebuilt the shop alone. The laughter that once filled it now echoed hollowly. Some fans imagine him reflecting, finally realizing the thin line they had crossed. Perhaps he thought of the students who might have been hurt, the potions misused, the lies told through their products. Perhaps he wondered if they had, without meaning to, taught a generation that deceit and laughter could coexist peacefully. His silence after Fred's death was not just grief, it was guilt turned inward, a recognition that laughter without responsibility leaves only emptiness behind. Fred and George Weasley gave the wizarding world joy during its darkest days, but their legacy remains morally complex. They were geniuses of mischief who never asked themselves the simplest of questions, should we? Their inventions blurred laughter and harm, rebellion and recklessness, and while they fought bravely when it mattered most, their disregard for moral consequence in peacetime revealed a troubling truth, that even the brightest sparks of humour can cast long, dangerous shadows when laughter forgets its limits. Number 19. Fred and George Weasley don't develop as characters. Fred and George Weasley burst into the Harry Potter series like twin comets, bright, mischievous, and unforgettable. From their very first appearance at King's Cross Station, joking about whether Harry really had a scar shaped like lightning, they immediately became symbols of rebellion and humour in a world growing darker with each book. Their laughter was infectious, their pranks legendary, and their defiance toward authority a breath of fresh air in a story often defined by rules and repression. Yet beneath the charm of their jokes lies a quieter truth. While other characters evolve, stumble, and mature, Fred and George remain almost frozen in time. They never truly change. For all their brilliance, the twins' arc is curiously static, a rare stillness in a saga that's otherwise about transformation. Harry Potter learns responsibility through pain and loss. Hermione Granger evolves from a perfectionist rule follower into a compassionate fighter who questions the system she once worshipped. Even Ron Weasley confronts jealousy, fear, and inadequacy before emerging as a loyal, brave man. But Fred and George, they stay the same boys who once turned Ron's teddy bear into a spider just to make him scream. Their pranks mature in scale, not in meaning. By the end of the series, they are still laughing at chaos, still winking at danger, still the jesters in a world that's burning. There is, of course, their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, often cited as proof of their growth. It's true that opening a successful business in Diagon Alley is an impressive achievement. It shows initiative, courage, and creativity. Yet, from a character standpoint, it feels like an extension of their school pranks, not a departure from them. Fred and George don't move on from mischief, they commercialize it. When Harry gives them his Triwizard winnings, saying, "I don't want it, use it to start your joke shop," the gesture carries weight. It's a symbolic passing of opportunity, but even with that, their path leads not toward maturity, but toward professionalized rebellion. They simply find a bigger stage for the same act. One could argue that laughter is their armor, that behind the jokes hides something deeper. When Dolores Umbridge takes over Hogwarts, the twins' defiance becomes an act of moral resistance. Their fireworks, swamp, and chaos are more than fun. They're protest. The moment they fly out of the castle, leaving behind a corridor full of cheering students, is one of the most triumphant scenes in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Yet even that rebellion doesn't spark introspection. Their courage is external, spectacular, yes, but unexamined. They never stop to wonder about the consequences of their mischief or the deeper implications of what they stand for. They fight for freedom, but they never reflect on what freedom demands. Contrast that with Neville Longbottom, a character who begins as a stammering boy losing his toad and ends by drawing the sword of Gryffindor to slay Nagini. Neville's transformation is about facing fear and discovering inner strength. Fred and George, on the other hand, remain fearless, almost too fearless. Fearlessness without reflection is not bravery, it's recklessness. They never learn humility or the weight of responsibility that comes with growing up in wartime. Even when Fred dies in Deathly Hallows, it's as though time freezes. His death is shocking precisely because he dies as he lived, laughing mid-battle, unchanged. Their relationship with family also reveals this static quality. Mrs. Weasley's constant anxiety about their future, her desperate wish that they choose respectable paths, never truly resolves. When she scolds them for testing fireworks in the kitchen or experimenting on unsuspecting siblings, it's not just nagging, it's maternal fear of their refusal to mature. And though they prove her wrong by becoming successful entrepreneurs, they never bridge the emotional gap. Fred's death ends their story before such reconciliation can happen. George's grief, shown in his hollow silence after his twin's death, is perhaps the only moment of true transformation. But it comes too late. Draco Malfoy offers an unexpected mirror. Arrogant, cruel, and prejudiced in the beginning, Draco experiences fear, doubt, and remorse as the series unfolds. He learns, painfully, that the ideology he inherited from his family is a lie. In Half-Blood Prince, when he stands trembling in front of Dumbledore, unable to cast the fatal curse, readers witness real human growth, the birth of conscience. Fred and George, in contrast, don't seem to question anything about themselves. They don't regret humiliating Percy when he tries to lecture them about ambition. They don't rethink the ethics of selling products like love potions, which toy with consent. Their humor shields them from moral examination. Even in moments of tragedy, their tone rarely changes. When Bill Weasley is attacked by Fenrir Greyback, the family gathers in grim silence. Fred tries to break the tension by joking, "Maybe Mum'll let me borrow a couple of pints of blood." It's classic Weasley humour, disarming, irreverent, but detached. The reader laughs but also feels the distance between Fred's wit and the emotional gravity of the moment. Humour, for them, replaces empathy. It's easier to make a joke than to sit in the silence of pain. This emotional stagnation becomes more striking when compared to the evolution of humour itself in the series. Harry, for instance, learns to use wit as survival, not escape. In Deathly Hallows, his sarcasm toward Voldemort is not childish defiance, it's moral clarity, a refusal to surrender his humanity. Fred and George never cross that line. Their jokes never deepen. Their laughter never becomes bittersweet. They remain eternal adolescents, untouched by the existential weight that defines everyone else. It's telling that their business thrives on illusions and tricks, products that distort reality. In a sense, their entire existence is built around making people forget pain, fear, and oppression for a moment. Their shop becomes a metaphor for their inner world, dazzling, loud, filled with colour, yet designed to distract. When Harry visits the store and sees shelves of skiving snack boxes and instant darkness powder, the scene sparkles with energy. But beneath that spectacle lies an unsettling truth. Fred and George are using humour to fight a war they refuse to fully face. They are jesters in a collapsing kingdom, laughing to drown out the sound of falling walls. Their interactions with Percy also underscore this lack of growth. Percy, though often insufferable, represents discipline and ambition. The twins ridicule him relentlessly, calling him head boy and mocking his pride. Yet by the end of the series, Percy's repentance feels more mature than their endless sarcasm. He faces the consequences of his arrogance, returns to his family, and fights beside them. Fred and George, meanwhile, never apologize for their cruelty toward him. It's not that readers expect them to lose their humor. It's that they never show emotional accountability. Even their friendship with Harry, while loyal, remains surface level. They support him, help him sneak out with the Marauder's map, and later give him gadgets from their shop. But unlike Hermione or Ron, they never challenge him, never force him to grow. Their relationship is based on camaraderie, not understanding. When Harry is consumed by grief or anger, the twins are rarely there in a meaningful emotional way. They are companions of laughter, not of silence. Fred's death could have been a turning point, the culmination of a journey toward depth and realization. But because he never truly changed, his death becomes tragic precisely for that reason. He dies laughing, leaving behind the same mischievous spark that defined him since the beginning. In a story where so many characters die transformed, Dumbledore through guilt, Snape through love, even Pettigrew through a fleeting moment of mercy, Fred dies unchanged. His laughter freezes in time, an echo of what could have been. And what of George? His silence after Fred's death hints at a dimension the twins never showed before. For the first time, we see one without the other, and it hurts. George's identity collapses. In that absence, readers glimpse the tragedy of their static nature. All their life, they were one character split in two. Without Fred, George is lost, unable to rebuild himself. It's as if all the growth, reflection, and transformation that never happened now haunt him as ghosts. Perhaps J.K. Rowling intended them as symbols of light in darkness, comic relief in tragedy, and they succeed magnificently at that. Yet within the larger architecture of Harry Potter, where nearly every major figure undergoes metamorphosis, their eternal boyhood stands out, charming but hollow. Their laughter, once liberating, becomes a kind of cage. The twins teach us that not all survival is evolution. Some people remain who they were, even when the world around them collapses and reforms. Fred and George Weasley never truly grow up. They only grow louder. Their story is a reminder that while humor can protect the heart, it can also keep it from ever truly opening. Number 20. Fred and George Weasley mock those who don't fit in. Fred and George Weasley are often celebrated as the comic relief of the Harry Potter series, the mischievous twins who bring laughter even into the darkest corners of Hogwarts. But behind the fireworks and pranks lies a more complex reality. Humor, when used without empathy, can easily turn into cruelty. The twins' jokes were not always harmless fun. More often than not, their targets were those who already felt like outsiders. The line between comedy and unkindness blurred whenever they found someone who didn't fit in, and it's here, in that subtle cruelty, that the real problem with Fred and George begins to show. At Hogwarts, laughter was their weapon and their shield. They wielded it with skill, knowing how to make a crowd roar with amusement. Yet every joke has a direction, and theirs often pointed downward, towards someone weaker, someone more vulnerable. One can't help but recall how often Percy Weasley became the butt of their humour. Their older brother, rigid, rule-bound and overly serious, stood as the perfect contrast to their rebellion. They called him the world's biggest prat, mocked his prefect badge, and rolled their eyes at his ambitions. "We're bringing you a bit of cheer, Percy, old boy," Fred would say, while mocking the very sense of order Percy clung to. To them, Percy's devotion to rules was ridiculous. But beneath that laughter was contempt for someone who couldn't or wouldn't be like them. Percy's isolation grew, and when he finally broke away from the family, it wasn't just politics that drove him out. Years of ridicule had already worn him down. Hermione Granger, too, felt the sting of their mockery. Her intelligence, her meticulous nature, her insistence on following the rules, all became reasons for laughter. The twins, along with Ron and others, sometimes treated her intellect as if it were a performance rather than a strength. They called her a know-it-all and rolled their eyes at her questions. Fred once joked, if brains were gold, Hermione would be richer than Gringotts. But it was not said as a compliment. It was said with that typical twin bravado, the kind that made people laugh while Hermione blushed and pretended not to care. Yet she did care. The mockery reinforced the message that her seriousness made her strange. In a school where fitting in mattered, that kind of humour could wound more than a hex. And then there was Luna Lovegood, the epitome of the outsider. Dreamy, odd, and unapologetically herself, she was an easy target for ridicule. While Fred and George did not torment her openly as some Slytherins might, they contributed to the culture that found her ridiculous. They joked about loony Lovegood like everyone else, their laughter a signal to others that eccentricity was to be laughed at, not admired. For two boys who prided themselves on being unconventional, their laughter at someone's difference was deeply ironic. They saw themselves as rebels, but they mocked the true rebel, the one brave enough to be strange in a world that prized conformity. Fred and George thrived on attention. They were performers in every sense. Every prank was theatre, every trick a stage act meant to draw applause. But when humour depends on humiliation, it becomes a form of dominance. Making others laugh by making someone else small is easy power. The twins' jokes often exposed this dynamic. Their targets were rarely those who could fight back on equal terms. Instead, they picked people who were too shy, too serious, or too different to defend themselves without looking foolish. It's one thing to make Umbridge's life miserable. That's rebellion. It's quite another to turn Hermione's seriousness or Percy's pride into a spectacle. That's mockery disguised as charm. There's a moment in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire that captures this imbalance perfectly. When Harry is struggling with the weight of being chosen as a Triwizard champion, Fred and George find humour in his confusion. They mockingly suggest he's playing hero again. It's meant as teasing, but Harry, already overwhelmed, feels isolated. "You're not still trying to figure out how you got in, are you?" George laughs while Fred adds, "Reckon you wanted a bit more fame?" Harry walks away silent. It's the laughter of friends that feels suddenly hollow, a reminder that even those closest to him sometimes choose jokes over understanding. The twins never intended to wound him, but their inability to sense when laughter turns sharp exposes their lack of emotional awareness. Their pranks on others within the Gryffindor common room were legendary, but they also reveal how easily the line between humour and humiliation could vanish. Remember when they enchanted snowballs to follow Professor Quirrell around, hitting the back of his turban? It seemed funny, until readers later realize Voldemort himself was attached to that very head. The joke becomes sinister in hindsight. The twins, unaware, were symbolically mocking danger itself, but it also highlights how their humour often ignored consequences. They laughed first, thought later. In their world, if people laughed, that was justification enough. Fred and George's relationship with Percy is perhaps the clearest window into this dynamic. Percy's ambition made him a target, but his eventual estrangement from the family was a tragedy that laughter helped build. When he walked away, their response was more sarcasm than sorrow. "Let him go," they said. "He's always thought he's better than us." It's a defensive reaction masking hurt with humour, but Percy's departure left a scar in the family, and in that scar one can trace years of ridicule disguised as sibling teasing. The twins' refusal to take him seriously mirrored their inability to see that words, even playful ones, could isolate rather than unite. In contrast, their treatment of Ron offers another kind of cruelty. Ron idolized his older brothers, yet Fred and George's constant teasing about his insecurities, his hand-me-downs, his fear of spiders, his clumsiness, chipped away at his confidence. "We'll send you a toilet seat from Hogwarts," they wrote him jokingly during his first year. But behind the humour was a reminder. They were the bold ones, the famous ones, while he was the awkward little brother. When Ron became a prefect, they mocked him just as they had mocked Percy, calling him another ministry man in the making. To them, authority was a joke, but to Ron it was a small victory he wanted to be proud of. They turned even that pride into laughter. The tragedy of Fred and George's humour lies in its brilliance. They were truly funny, their wit, timing, and creativity unmatched. They built an empire of laughter, from prank suites to fireworks that could outshine any dark cloud, but in doing so they also built walls. Those who laughed with them belonged. Those who didn't or couldn't were left outside. It's a reflection of how humour can divide as easily as it unites. When laughter becomes a social weapon, it reinforces hierarchies of who's in and who's out. And Fred and George, for all their warmth, helped shape that hierarchy at Hogwarts. To understand their toxicity, one must also understand their need to be loved. The twins thrived on approval. They were performers because applause gave them worth. When the crowd laughed, it meant they mattered. Mocking others wasn't just cruelty, it was self-preservation. In a family of 7 where each child had to carve out a place, they used laughter as identity. Percy had ambition, Bill had adventure, Charlie had dragons, Ron had friendship with the boy who lived, Fred and George had humour, and they wielded it like armour. Their cruelty came not from hatred, but from fear of irrelevance. Even after Fred's death, the echoes of their laughter linger in the story. It's tempting to romanticize him as the twin who died with a smile, the joker whose light never dimmed. But perhaps that's the easy way out. The deeper truth is more human. Fred died as he lived, with humour on his lips and unresolved pain in his heart. George, left behind, faced the silence that follows laughter. In that silence, one imagines the weight of every joke that had once been thrown without thought. Humour can be a bridge or a blade. And when the laughter stopped, George had to confront what had been hidden behind it all along. Fred and George were brave, loyal, and full of life. They fought for what was right, defied tyranny, and stood by Harry when it mattered. Yet their story also teaches something subtle, that kindness is not the same as charm, and courage is not the same as confidence. True strength lies in empathy, in seeing others not as punchlines, but as people. When they mocked Percy, Hermione, or Luna, they failed that test. They chose laughter over love. And though their jokes may have filled the halls of Hogwarts with joy, they also left behind a quieter echo, the sound of those who laughed along but never quite felt included. Humour is one of the most human forms of power. It can heal, or it can hurt. Fred and George Weasley remind us that even the brightest laughter casts shadows. Being the life of the party is easy when you're never the target. Being kind, that's harder. It requires seeing the person behind the peculiarity, the humanity behind the habit. Fred and George, for all their brilliance, often missed that truth. And in their laughter, Hogwarts learned a lesson it didn't realize it was being taught, that even the funniest people can sometimes be the cruelest, and that true courage begins not with rebellion, but with compassion. Number 21. Fred and George Weasley's rebellion against Umbridge hurt others. When Fred and George Weasley decided to rebel against Dolores Umbridge, the air inside Hogwarts Castle was already thick with fear. The walls seemed to absorb her cruelty, pink, flowery, and suffocating. Students whispered in corridors. The word detention had begun to sound like a death sentence. The Weasley twins, restless spirits of laughter and chaos, could not stand the oppression. They wanted to fight back, to reclaim Hogwarts for its students. Yet, in their blaze of rebellion, something darker lingered behind the smoke of fireworks, the price paid by others for their glorious departure. Their grand act was unforgettable. Fred and George unleashed a storm of magical fireworks, sparking dragons, whizzing Catherine wheels, and rockets that wrote rude words in the sky. Dolores Umbridge ran through the corridors, shouting orders that were ignored or mocked. "Well, that was worth 50 points from Gryffindor," one student whispered with awe, as the twins soared through the castle, their laughter echoing behind them. It was the purest act of defiance Hogwarts had seen in years. The image of Fred and George flying out of the castle, leaving behind a swamp in the 5th floor corridor, became legend. But legends have shadows, and the shadow of this one stretched over everyone who remained. The swamp was a symbol, a reminder that Umbridge could be mocked, that her power had limits. But for the younger students, it was also a nightmare. They could no longer pass through certain corridors, classes were relocated in haste, and the air smelled of stagnant water and mischief gone too far. Filch, desperate to impress Umbridge, tried to clear the mess but failed miserably. Professors avoided confrontation except for Flitwick, who later removed a part of the swamp out of the kindness of his heart. Yet his words, light-hearted as they were, could not hide the exhaustion that had settled over the teachers. The rebellion had not ended Umbridge's tyranny. It had only provoked her to tighten her grip. Umbridge's retaliation was swift and ruthless. Detentions multiplied. The inquisitorial squad, led by Draco Malfoy, prowled the halls like wolves. They found satisfaction in tormenting those who dared to laugh at the fireworks. "If this is a joke, Weasley, it's wearing thin," Umbridge had once told George, and now she was determined that the joke was over. Students who had admired the twins found themselves targets of suspicion. Even the faintest grin could earn a week of writing lines in blood. It was as if the rebellion gave her an excuse to unleash even more cruelty, and she took it gladly. Inside the Gryffindor common room, the mood shifted. For a night, Fred and George were heroes. Lee Jordan, their closest ally, spoke with pride about how they had given Hogwarts a show it would never forget. But the laughter did not last. The next morning, students were scolded, house points were slashed, and those who helped the twins, or were merely suspected of helping them, faced detention. Hermione Granger, practical as always, muttered that we need organized resistance, not chaos. Harry, though secretly delighted by the spectacle, could not deny she was right. The rebellion had lifted spirits, but also made life at Hogwarts even harder. The teachers, too, were trapped between admiration and despair. Professor McGonagall had long admired the Weasley twins' ingenuity, once saying they had more talent than they knew how to use. But after their departure, she was left to deal with the aftermath. Frightened first years, angry parents, and a headmistress who seemed to grow more vindictive by the hour. Lessons were interrupted constantly, and students were too nervous to focus. Even Hagrid's absence at the time deepened the emptiness. The spirit of unity that once defined Hogwarts had fractured. The Weasley twins' act was rebellion at its most romantic, bold, funny, and unforgettable. But rebellion without structure leaves ruins behind. Fred and George were not strategists. They were performers. Their aim was to humiliate Umbridge, not to reform the system she represented. And so, when they flew away into the sunset, they left behind a school still under her control, more chaotic and fearful than ever. Their swamp might have been a masterpiece of mischief, but for the frightened Ravenclaw girl who got lost on her way to class and missed her exam, it was just another reason to cry. Harry himself could not help but admire the twins' courage. Yet, as he walked through the broken corridors afterward, he realized how lonely resistance could feel when the show was over. Umbridge's presence became heavier, her punishments crueler. The dream of rebellion turned into a whisper. "What will happen to us now?" whispered by trembling lips in the library's shadow. The spark Fred and George ignited had flared brightly, but it left behind the smell of burnt hope. It is easy to cheer for defiance when one is not left to face the consequences. The Weasley twins, always chasing the thrill of laughter, forgot that Hogwarts was not a stage, but a home. After their departure, the students still had to wake each morning under Umbridge's rule, still had to endure the Carrow's whispers and the tightening of control. Their prank had exposed Umbridge's inability to command respect, but it also revealed how fragile the students' morale had become. Laughter without leadership fades quickly. Among the teachers, tension brewed silently. Professor Snape, ever cold and observant, found the chaos useful. It allowed him to move unseen through the corridors. Professor Sprout was appalled by the damage to the castle's magical plants caused by the swamp's spreading moisture. Filch wept openly when his mop broke trying to clean it. The rebellion became not just a memory, but a scar, a symbol of what it cost to defy authority without a plan. Even Dumbledore's absence at the time deepened the wound. The students were leaderless, the teachers divided, and the castle uneasy. Yet no one could deny the emotional power of that moment when Fred and George flew away. "Give her hell from us, Peeves!" George had shouted, and for once even Peeves obeyed. It was a moment of unity. Students from all houses cheering together, Slytherins included, as the twins vanished into the horizon. But once the echoes of their laughter faded, the halls grew colder. Peeves's chaos was amusing for a time until broken windows and overturned statues made it clear that anarchy is rarely as fun as it seems. Weeks later, rumours spread that Fred and George had opened a shop in Diagon Alley, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Their fame soared, and their products became the stuff of legend. But inside Hogwarts, the students whispered about the price of glory. The swamp was still there, partly preserved by Professor Flitwick as a monument to mischief. It was charming, yes, but also haunting, a reminder of how rebellion could be both inspiring and destructive. Hermione, always the voice of reason, once said that resistance works best when it brings people together, not tears them apart. The Weasley twins had done the opposite. They had inspired a momentary joy but deepened the cracks that Umbridge exploited. The rebellion had been a firework, bright, explosive, and fleeting. It lit up the sky but left darkness in its wake. In hindsight, one might say that Fred and George's rebellion was a necessary spark and that their act kept the spirit of defiance alive when fear was suffocating it. But one might also argue that it was reckless. They did not stay to help rebuild, to organize, to protect. They left, and those who admired them had to face the fury of a dictator without their laughter to soften the blows. It was a victory of emotion over strategy, a triumph of courage without consequence for its leaders. Perhaps that is the tragedy of the Weasley twins' rebellion. It was not born of selfishness, but of passion, of love for the school they could no longer stand to see corrupted. Yet in their attempt to save it, they unintentionally made life harder for those who remained. Their flight from the castle was a cry for freedom, but for the students still trapped inside, it sounded more like farewell. Hogwarts learned that day that rebellion without responsibility is only half a revolution. And so, the swamp on the 5th floor remained. Students passed by it for years, some laughing, others shaking their heads. To some, it was the finest joke ever pulled at Hogwarts. To others, it was a lesson. Courage alone is not enough. The Weasley twins would always be remembered as heroes of humour, but also as a warning that even laughter, when used as a weapon, can wound. Behind every burst of fireworks lies the echo of those left in the dark, cleaning the ashes. Number 22, Fred and George Weasley avoided real responsibility. Fred and George Weasley were the heartbeat of laughter in a world drowning in fear. They were the spark that lit up the gloomy corners of Hogwarts and the comforting reminder that even in war, joy could still exist. But beneath their brilliance and their unmatched humour lay a quiet contradiction. While others of their family faced the growing shadow of Lord Voldemort head-on, Fred and George stood apart, clever, brave in their own way, yet unwilling to step fully into the dark storm gathering around them. The truth is not that they were cowards, but that they chose a different kind of safety. One that, for all its colour and laughter, avoided the heaviest burden of responsibility. When the Order of the Phoenix began its quiet mobilization, the Weasley household was transformed into a war council. Arthur worked late in the ministry, risking his life to protect Muggle-borns. Molly worried and prayed for her sons, sending letters filled with trembling fear. Bill fought in Egypt, Charlie in Romania, and later both stood shoulder to shoulder with Dumbledore's allies. Even Ron, who had been just a boy when Harry arrived at the Burrow, chose to follow Harry into danger time and again. In that same house, Fred and George packed boxes of skiving snack boxes and extendable ears. Their work was extraordinary, but it also became their shield, a way to stay useful without standing on the front line. When they opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley, London was trembling under the return of the Dark Lord. Diagon Alley is almost empty, Rowling writes, describing how fear had spread like smoke. Yet in that emptiness the Weasley twins set up a shop full of laughter and neon explosions. To many it looked like rebellion, a way to resist fear through humour. But there was also something deeply escapist in it. Fred once said, "If we're going to be murdered by you-know-who, we might as well do it in style." It was a joke, of course, but inside the joke was a hint of truth. Humour was their armour, and their excuse. While others risked their lives for causes, Fred and George risked their savings. Their shop flourished even as chaos deepened. The invention of shield hats and Peruvian instant darkness powder proved they were geniuses of magical innovation, but their magic rarely aimed at the enemy directly. The twins sold tools of defense, yet they themselves remained behind the counter. They became merchants of courage rather than warriors of it. Their products helped aurors and students, yes, but their absence on the battlefield left a quiet question in the air. Where would their loyalty have taken them if profit were not at stake? There is a memorable moment during the rise of Voldemort's power when Fred and George could have joined the Order as full members. Instead, they joked about their mother's overprotectiveness and the importance of keeping the shop running. It was easier to laugh than to face the terror that consumed others. Their shop became a refuge, a brightly coloured sanctuary away from the screams and disappearances echoing through the wizarding world. George once said, we've got to give people a reason to smile." Noble words indeed. But sometimes making people smile was also a way to avoid seeing them cry. The contrast with their brother Percy was striking. Percy, for all his arrogance and mistakes, believed deeply in the structure of duty, even if he served it wrongly at first. He joined the ministry because he thought it was his responsibility to maintain order. Fred and George rejected that sense of structure entirely. They lived in the moment, embracing chaos and irreverence. Their detachment from authority made them lovable, but it also distanced them from real accountability. When war demanded structure, discipline and sacrifice, the pranksters remained outside that circle, not out of malice, but out of an almost childlike resistance to being told what to do. It is easy to forget that during the final year, at Hogwarts, under the rule of the Carrows and the terror of Snape's regime, Fred and George were not there. They had left school 2 years earlier in a blaze of fireworks, escaping on broomsticks after turning their rebellion into spectacle. The scene is unforgettable, the skies filled with dragons of fire, the corridors echoing with laughter and chaos. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," Fred had shouted as they fled. The entire moment became legendary, a symbol of freedom. Yet it was also symbolic of their deeper flaw. They left the system instead of fighting to reform it. They escaped the nightmare rather than confront it. Meanwhile, others stayed. Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, and Ginny Weasley, younger, less prepared, more vulnerable, fought within Hogwarts, forming Dumbledore's army. They endured torture, punishment, and humiliation. Fred and George from their shop in Diagon Alley provided magical assistance, but not presence. Their inventions reached Hogwarts in secret parcels, but their courage stayed comfortably at home. This absence is what makes their later participation in the Battle of Hogwarts so tragic and paradoxically so redemptive. When Fred finally joined the fight during the last battle, it was as if he had come full circle. The laughter that once echoed through classrooms now resounded through corridors littered with bodies and curses. He fought beside Percy, the brother he had mocked, and in that moment responsibility caught up with him. Percy had returned, begging forgiveness, and Fred forgave him instantly, smiling even as the castle shook. "You actually are joking, Percy. I don't think I've heard you joke since you were—" The sentence never finished. The explosion tore through the wall and Fred fell, still smiling. His death was cruel, not just because it ended a life, but because it symbolized the cost of delayed responsibility. Fred's death shattered George. For the first time, laughter failed him. The shop that once echoed with jokes became silent. It is telling that after the war, George continued the business, but the joy had dimmed. In interviews, Rowling revealed that George never fully recovered. The twin who survived had to live with the question his brother never answered. What if they had done more sooner? What if their genius, their courage, their unity had been aimed directly at the heart of evil instead of at the wallets of customers? Yet perhaps their avoidance of responsibility was not simple fear, but fatigue with a world that demanded too much of everyone. The Weasley twins had grown up in poverty, surrounded by conflict and worry. Their mother's tears, their father's endless ministry troubles, and the shadow of their brother's success must have pressed on them. Laughter became their rebellion against despair. It was their way of saying no to the endless seriousness of life. But rebellion without direction easily turns into escape. They fought fear with fireworks, and fireworks, no matter how bright, eventually fade. The magical world, after Voldemort's return, demanded heroes who could stand in the fire without flinching. Fred and George danced around it instead. Their shop became a safe haven, but also a distraction from the collective struggle. When one looks at their choices beside those of Harry, Hermione, and Ron, three people of their own generation, the difference is stark. While the trio infiltrated the Ministry, hunted Horcruxes, and faced death repeatedly, the twins perfected nosebleed nougats and love potions. Their creativity was dazzling, but it remained safely commercial, never sacrificial. One cannot deny their bravery, and their departure from Hogwarts under Umbridge's nose was a masterpiece of defiance. But courage without consequence is entertainment. Courage with consequence is sacrifice. The Weasley twins mastered the former and only tasted the latter in their final hours. Fred's death, in that sense, feels like the universe forcing him to pay the price he had avoided for years. It's an unbearably poetic punishment. A life spent avoiding gravity ends crushed beneath it. Still, their story is essential because it reveals a truth often hidden in tales of war. Not all heroes wear armor. Some wear laughter like a shield. Fred and George's refusal to take full responsibility reflected a universal fear. The fear of losing oneself to duty, of surrendering the freedom to be happy. They clung to that freedom until the very end, yet their story warns us that even joy must learn to serve something greater, or it risks becoming hollow. In the shadow of Voldemort, every wizard had to choose a side. Fred and George chose humor, and for a time, that was enough. But when the darkness grew too deep, even laughter could not keep it away. In the ruins of Hogwarts, after the final battle, George stood over his brother's body. Around him, the survivors were counting the dead. Harry was silent. Ron wept. Molly's cries echoed through the hall. George, who had once filled every silence with jokes, said nothing. That silence was the sound of responsibility. Too late, too heavy, but finally understood. It was as if all the laughter of their youth had led to this moment, where one twin paid for both. And in that silence, George finally became the adult Fred had never had the chance to be. The legacy of Fred and George Weasley remains divided, part light, part shadow. They gave the world laughter in its darkest hour, but they also revealed how easily laughter can become a hiding place. Their magic was brilliant, their hearts pure, yet their story reminds us that even the brightest fireworks must face the night they try to outshine. Number 23. Fred and George Weasley encouraged a culture of permissiveness. Fred and George Weasley were not just known for their mischievous personalities. They were emblematic of a more troubling aspect of their character, their systematic undermining of rules and authority at Hogwarts. It wasn't simply that they broke the rules, they did so with such an audacious sense of entitlement that they seemed to believe the rules didn't apply to them at all. Their entire approach to life at Hogwarts sent a clear message to everyone around them. If you're funny enough, you can get away with anything. This attitude, while often amusing and entertaining, created a toxic environment where mischief overshadowed respect for order, responsibility, and even for the people around them. Fred and George were the ultimate embodiment of the idea that humour could be used as a weapon, not just for entertainment, but for dismantling any structure that might hold them or others accountable. They made a game out of breaking rules, which in itself might have seemed harmless if it weren't for the consequences it had on the younger students who admired them. Their pranks weren't just acts of rebellion, they were demonstrations of what was possible when authority and tradition were ignored. They were pioneers of a culture that placed fun above everything else, including order and decorum. One of the most memorable examples of their carefree attitude toward rules was their launch of the joke shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. While their business venture ultimately became successful, it wasn't without its share of controversy. They made a fortune selling products that were designed to break every rule in the book. From products that caused mischief to ones that could even be dangerous, their shop was a direct challenge to the school's rules and to authority in general. Their entrepreneurial success came at the cost of teaching their peers that rules were not worth following if you could find a way around them. Fred and George's pranks didn't stop at personal gain. They influenced an entire generation of Hogwarts students. Younger students, especially, looked up to them as heroes. To them, the twins represented a kind of freedom from the oppressive rules and regulations that governed the lives of ordinary students. They didn't just break the rules, they showed that breaking them could be fun. The younger students, enamored by their charm and wit, began to see rule-breaking as a sign of power. They learned that if you could make others laugh, you could avoid consequences, no matter how severe your actions were. The twins had created a space where the value of humor and fun eclipsed the value of respect for authority and boundaries. The most significant impact of Fred and George's behavior was felt in their interactions with the faculty. Teachers at Hogwarts, rather than confronting the twins' behavior, often chose to look the other way, almost as if they were complicit in the boys' disregard for authority. The twins played the role of class clowns, constantly pulling off pranks in front of their professors, and yet they rarely faced any serious repercussions. Take, for example, their escapades with Filch, the caretaker, whose attempts to stop their mischief were futile. His frustration was met with laughter, while the professors, who should have supported him, allowed Fred and George to continue their antics without serious consequences. The twins' ability to evade punishment was largely due to their charm and wit. They had an uncanny ability to make those around them laugh, and this often served as a shield against the backlash that should have come with their actions. Even when they crossed a line, their humor allowed them to deflect any criticism or reprimand. For instance, when Fred and George invented products that interfered with school events, their antics weren't seen as malicious by the faculty, they were seen as entertaining. This perpetuated the idea that if you could entertain others, you were above reproach. The teacher's reluctance to discipline the twins fostered an environment where the value of humor overshadowed the importance of structure and respect. The twins' behavior wasn't just a harmless rebellion, it created an atmosphere where authority was constantly challenged and undermined. The professors at Hogwarts, who were charged with upholding the rules, often allowed the twins to act with impunity. In one particularly telling incident, Fred and George set off a set of fireworks during the start-of-term feast, causing chaos in the Great Hall. The entire event could have been a serious disruption, yet no immediate punishment followed. Instead, the fireworks were simply a spectacle, with the students laughing and cheering. The lack of consequences showed that their actions were not seen as serious breaches of conduct, but as part of the students' culture of fun. The message was clear. Even disruptive behavior could be excused if it was done in the name of humor. Fred and George's impact on their peers was not solely confined to their pranks. They also subtly pushed the boundaries of respect, both for others and for themselves. They rarely considered the emotional or physical toll their pranks took on others. The most telling example of this was their treatment of their younger brother, Ron. While they often teased him mercilessly, the consequences of their actions were rarely addressed. In one notable instance, when they decided to force Ron to take part in a prank against a fellow student, they ignored his discomfort, prioritizing their own amusement over his feelings. Their behavior highlighted a crucial flaw in their approach. They didn't take into account the effect their actions had on others, especially those who were more vulnerable or less inclined to challenge them. Fred and George's legacy is one of cultural disintegration, where the importance of responsibility and respect was minimized in favor of a fun, carefree attitude that disregarded the consequences of one's actions. They became symbols of a generation that valued laughter over discipline, fun over duty, and irreverence over respect. Their actions had the unintended effect of eroding the values that Hogwarts, indeed, society at large, stood for. In the end, the twins' brand of mischief contributed to a culture where norms and expectations were regularly violated, and where the consequences of those violations were either ignored or downplayed. Their departure from Hogwarts marked the beginning of a different chapter for both them and the school. As they ventured into the world of business, they brought their brand of humor with them, expanding their joke shop and continuing to flout the rules. But their influence extended far beyond the walls of Hogwarts. The students they left behind were the ones who had watched them break the rules, and many of them took those lessons to heart. Fred and George's legacy didn't just live on in their products, it lived on in the attitudes of those who followed them. The world of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became a symbol of a world where fun and laughter could override the mundane strictures of everyday life. Yet despite their success, Fred and George's actions were not without consequence. Their pranks, while often well-intentioned and amusing, created a world where the lines between right and wrong were blurred. By constantly bending or breaking the rules, they taught their peers that the consequences of their actions were optional. Their legacy is one of mixed messages. On the one hand, they showed that creativity and humor could be powerful tools for success. On the other hand, they set a dangerous precedent where the value of rules and respect for others was trivialized. Ultimately, Fred and George Weasley were more than just pranksters. They were champions of a culture that valued humor over responsibility, fun over order, and mischief over respect. Their antics, while entertaining, contributed to the erosion of trust in authority and the dismissal of norms. By promoting a world where anything could be forgiven in the name of a good laugh, they helped shape a generation of students who were less likely to respect boundaries or take responsibility for their actions. In the end, Fred and George's influence on Hogwarts was not just about their pranks, but about the cultural shift they inspired, a shift where rules were for others, but not for those who could make everyone laugh. Number 24. Fred and George Weasley never took Ron seriously. Fred and George Weasley were known for their mischievous nature, their love for pranks, and their undeniable ability to make everyone around them laugh. However, their playful antics often came at the expense of their younger brother, Ron. While they were supportive of Harry Potter and, in many ways, served as mentors to him, their treatment of Ron painted a different picture. Fred and George never quite took Ron seriously, and this created a deep emotional rift between the brothers that would follow Ron throughout his life. From the very beginning, Ron was the youngest of a large family, often overshadowed by the achievements of his older brothers. Bill, Charlie, Percy, and Fred and George were all individuals with strong personalities and remarkable talents. Bill had a successful career at Gringotts, Charlie was a famous dragon tamer, and Percy had ambitions to climb the ministry ladder. Meanwhile, Fred and George were already well known for their entrepreneurial spirit, running their own joke shop and becoming somewhat legends in the wizarding world. But then there was Ron, always in the background, always the one who seemed to be struggling with his own sense of identity. It was clear that Ron loved his family, but the love was often tinged with a sense of inferiority. He never felt like he measured up to any of his brothers. His growing insecurity, his feelings of being second best, were amplified by the very people who should have been his greatest supporters, Fred and George. The Weasley twins enjoyed teasing Ron. They found it amusing to make him the butt of their jokes. Whether it was using him as a subject for their pranks or mocking his nervousness, they took pleasure in his discomfort. This behavior wasn't out of malice per se, but it highlighted their lack of empathy for their younger brother's emotional state. As the youngest, Ron was already battling against the constant comparison to his older siblings. Instead of offering him support, Fred and George often mocked his shortcomings. It wasn't that Fred and George lacked love for Ron. On the contrary, they cared for him deeply. But they did not understand the lasting damage their teasing was causing. For them it was all in good fun, part of their usual banter. To Ron, however, it was a daily reminder that he was never quite good enough. When Fred and George made jokes at his expense, it reinforced the belief that he was always going to be in their shadow. One of the most telling moments came when Ron, still a young boy, was tasked with accompanying Fred and George to the joke shop. The twins treated him like an afterthought, using him as a tool for their own amusement rather than involving him in their ventures seriously. In their eyes, Ron was just a kid, someone to laugh at rather than someone who deserved their respect and attention. They never gave him a chance to show his own strengths, and as a result, Ron's self-confidence began to erode. Ron's sense of self-worth was further diminished during the Triwizard Tournament. While Harry had earned the title of the boy who lived, becoming a hero at an age when most children were focused on simple schoolwork, Ron was left to watch in the background. Fred and George, ever the pranksters, found the whole situation amusing. They were not concerned with the emotional toll it took on Ron. Their jokes and pranks during that time only served to distance them further from their brother, leaving him to grapple with feelings of inadequacy. One of the most poignant moments in the series came during the Yule Ball. Ron, who was already feeling like an outsider in his own family, watched as Harry, Fred, and George excelled in ways that Ron could never seem to match. While his brothers were out enjoying themselves, Ron was left feeling like the awkward one, unsure of where he fit in. This sense of displacement was exacerbated by Fred and George's teasing. They treated the situation lightly, as if it were just another joke, but for Ron it was a reminder of his own perceived shortcomings. Fred and George's treatment of Ron may not have been malicious, but it was thoughtless. In a family where love and affection were abundant, their playful jabs at Ron stood out as a stark contrast. The twins, who had a strong bond with each other, never fully understood how isolating it could be to be on the receiving end of their jokes. They didn't realize that their light-hearted teasing was reinforcing Ron's feelings of being less than. They saw Ron as their little brother who could take a joke, not as a young man struggling with his own self-worth. In many ways, Fred and George's behavior mirrored the dynamics that had already existed in Ron's life. From his earliest days at Hogwarts, Ron was always in Harry's shadow. He was the sidekick, the loyal friend, but never the hero. While Harry fought dark forces and became a beacon of hope, Ron was often left in the background. Fred and George, although they meant no harm, contributed to this feeling of insignificance. They didn't see the need to validate Ron's worth because they assumed he already knew it. Perhaps the most striking example of this dynamic occurred during the Battle of Hogwarts, when Fred, one of the twins who had perpetuated so much of Ron's emotional struggle, fell in battle. The family was devastated. Fred's death left a gaping hole in the Weasley family, and Ron, who had always felt like the overlooked one, was suddenly forced to confront a reality where the twins were no longer there to laugh at him. It was in this moment of loss and grief that Ron's relationship with Fred and George truly came into focus. In the aftermath of Fred's death, Ron was left to carry on without the constant teasing that had shaped his emotional landscape for so many years. There was no longer anyone around to make light of his shortcomings, but the damage had already been done. Ron's struggle with his own sense of worth had been compounded by years of being underestimated by the people closest to him. Fred and George's failure to ever truly support him left a void in Ron's emotional life that he would have to work through for the rest of his journey. Though Fred and George certainly did love Ron, their behavior inadvertently left him with a deep-seated insecurity. Their constant teasing and failure to see beyond his awkwardness or mistakes made him feel inferior, even though they never intended to do so. They never stopped to consider how their jokes might affect Ron's sense of self-worth, and this lack of consideration affected their relationship for years. It's a tragic irony that it took Fred's death to make Ron realize how much he had been loved, but how much that love had been expressed in ways that were not always healthy for him. Through it all, however, Ron remained loyal to his brothers, never once questioning his place within the family, despite the emotional toll it had taken. Number 25. Fred and George Weasley could be cruel even to their friends. Fred and George Weasley were always the life of the party at Hogwarts, the jokesters who could turn any mundane moment into a burst of laughter. Their tricks, their pranks, and their relentless teasing made them famous, but beneath that fun-loving exterior lay a tendency to push the boundaries of what could be considered good-natured humor. To many, the twins embodied the spirit of youthful rebellion, the kind that took risks for a laugh, but the deeper reality of their friendships reveals something more complex. The Weasley twins weren't always the benevolent pranksters they appeared to be. Sometimes their jokes crossed the line, and it was evident that their concept of friendship wasn't always rooted in respect or kindness. The bond between Fred and George was undeniable. They were more than just brothers. They were partners in mischief, constantly plotting and scheming together to outwit teachers, trick their classmates, and challenge authority. Their joint enterprise, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, was born from their shared love of inventing amusing products, Yet it was also a reminder of how much their humor was entwined with their sense of self-worth and identity. They weren't simply pranksters for fun, they thrived on pushing people's limits, sometimes at the expense of those who trusted them. Their ability to make others laugh often came at the cost of the feelings of the very people who called them friends. One of the most striking examples of the twins' cruelty in their friendships was their treatment of Hermione Granger. Hermione, with her sharp intellect and passion for her studies, was often the target of their teasing. Fred and George's jokes about her academic drive were, at times, light-hearted, but they could also be mean-spirited. They mocked her for being a know-it-all, a label that many at Hogwarts used to isolate Hermione. The Weasley twins' teasing was often more than harmless jests. It was an attempt to belittle her enthusiasm for learning. They, who thrived on humor and adventure, saw Hermione's focus on her studies as something to be mocked, even though her diligence often helped save the day. The cruelty was evident when they, along with Ron, made fun of Hermione after she was caught using the time-turner to attend multiple classes at once. While Hermione's secret was eventually revealed in a way that highlighted her resilience, the twins' initial reaction was to ridicule her behind her back, laughing at her obsession with her schoolwork. They failed to recognize the pressure she was under, and instead they chose to poke fun at her. Even in a moment of stress, the twins chose humor over understanding. Their behavior wasn't limited to Hermione. Neville Longbottom, another one of their classmates, was also a frequent target for their jokes. Neville's awkwardness and lack of confidence made him an easy target for the twins' pranks. Fred and George never hesitated to mock him for his clumsiness, labeling him as useless or hopeless. Their jests, though often delivered with a smile, weren't always as innocent as they appeared. Neville, who already struggled with his self-esteem, found his classmates' teasing only made things harder. When Neville finally stood up to the twins during a crucial moment in the Battle of Hogwarts, it became clear that while Fred and George might have thought of themselves as harmless jokers, their actions sometimes had consequences. Neville had been the subject of their ridicule for years, yet in the end, it was Neville's courage that triumphed, not the Weasley twins' wit. This moment of triumph was not just a testament to Neville's growth as a person, but also a sharp reminder that true friendships are built on mutual respect, not on the kind of mockery that Fred and George often indulged in. The twins' understanding of friendship seemed to fall short when it came to the emotional consequences of their actions. They viewed friendship through the lens of their own comfort, often assuming that their friends would simply laugh off the hurt they caused, as they themselves did. They were quick to justify their behavior with the phrase, "We're just messing around, we're friends." But the truth was that not everyone shared their definition of what friendship should be. Friendship, at its core, is about support, empathy, and understanding. It's about knowing when to laugh and knowing when to stop. The Weasley twins, however, often mistook the privilege of friendship for the right to treat their friends as the punchlines of their jokes. Fred and George's behavior also reveals something important about the way humor is sometimes used to deflect from deeper emotional truths. In the Weasley family, there was an abundance of warmth and love, but there was also a heavy burden of family expectations. Fred and George were always the ones to lighten the mood with jokes, yet it's clear that their pranks sometimes served as a mask for the harder truths they didn't want to face. Their sense of humor was often a shield, protecting them from the pressures they felt, particularly the looming threat of the growing war against Voldemort. By laughing it off and making others laugh with them, they managed to keep the weight of the world at bay. But that didn't change the fact that their jokes sometimes hurt the people closest to them. The twins' treatment of their younger brother Ron was another instance where their humour often had a more damaging impact. While they undoubtedly loved Ron, their constant teasing of him was a reminder of how their sense of humour could sometimes go too far. Ron, often in the shadow of his more charismatic brothers, was frequently the subject of their pranks. Fred and George's relentless teasing, while meant to be affectionate, sometimes left Ron feeling inadequate and overlooked. Their jokes about his fears, his insecurities, and his mistakes were made without considering how vulnerable Ron already felt. Yet despite all this, Ron's bond with his brothers remained unshaken. In many ways, Ron understood that Fred and George's teasing came from a place of love, though that didn't make it any easier to endure. In the end, Ron's ability to forgive and accept his brother's flaws was a testament to the resilience of their sibling bond. But it also highlighted the fact that just because someone is family, it doesn't mean they should be allowed to get away with hurtful behavior. In their later years, Fred and George's pranks grew more sophisticated, and their business success provided them with a platform to spread their brand of humor to the masses. Yet, even as they became more successful, their treatment of others didn't always change. Their dynamic with their fellow students remained one of light-hearted mockery, often at the expense of others' dignity. Their jokes, while still funny to some, continued to reinforce the idea that it was okay to cross boundaries for the sake of a laugh. They seemed to believe that friendship could somehow absolve them of any wrongdoing, as though their bond with others made their actions beyond reproach. Fred and George's eventual downfall, with Fred's tragic death during the Battle of Hogwarts, only serves to deepen the complexity of their character. While Fred's death left an irreparable hole in the Weasley family, it also left behind a legacy of humour that had, at times, caused pain. His death was a stark reminder that humour, while it can heal, can also wound. The twins' life and death were marked by their insistence on seeing everything through a lens of comedy, and while they brought joy to many, they also reminded everyone of the delicate balance between humour and kindness. By the end of their journey, Fred and George's legacy was far from simple. They were not just the funny twins who made everyone laugh, they were also brothers who, despite their flaws, loved each other and their family. Their journey serves as a reminder that friendship, even in its most playful forms, requires care, respect, and awareness of how our actions affect others. Fred and George Weasley, for all their laughter and fun, also showed that sometimes even the best of friends can go too far, and that the line between playful humour and hurtful cruelty is often thinner than we think. Number 26. Fred and George Weasley used humour as a defence mechanism. Fred and George Weasley are often remembered by fans of the Harry Potter series for their infectious laughter, their endless pranks, and their ever-optimistic outlook. The twin brothers, a constant source of comic relief throughout the books, bring joy and humour to even the darkest situations. Their shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, is a testament to their creativity, their entrepreneurial spirit, and most of all, their ability to make people laugh. On the surface, Fred and George are confident, fearless, and the epitome of youthful exuberance. But beneath their light-hearted antics, a more complex truth lurks, one that reveals how their humour was often used as a defence mechanism, a way to shield themselves from the vulnerability that came with loss, fear, and the harsh realities of the world they lived in. From the very beginning of the series, Fred and George show a remarkable ability to turn almost any situation into a joke. In their first appearance, they are already causing mischief at Hogwarts, delighting in their practical jokes and giving Harry his first taste of the magic that lay ahead. Their humour is a signature trait, something that sets them apart from other characters. They are larger-than-life figures, always ready with a quip or a prank to break the tension. But as we follow them through the story, it becomes evident that their humor is not just for entertainment, it's a coping mechanism. When we first meet the twins, they are full of life, brimming with confidence. They seem to have it all together. But, as with most things in the wizarding world, the surface does not always reflect the full story. Fred and George come from a family that, while full of love and support, is also marked by financial strain and the weight of expectations. Their parents, Arthur and Molly, are constantly juggling their love for their children with the harsh realities of a family struggling to make ends meet. The Weasley household is chaotic and overcrowded, and Fred and George, like their siblings, often have to make do with what they have. Yet through all this, they manage to remain upbeat, their humor acting as a balm for the struggles they face. But humor, as we soon learn, is often a mask. Beneath the playful banter and carefree attitude, Fred and George carry a quiet burden. Their sense of humor is not merely about making others laugh, it's a shield against the more painful emotions they refuse to express. They rarely, if ever, talk about their fears, their doubts, or their losses. They don't discuss their feelings of inadequacy or the pressures of being in the shadow of their older brothers, Bill, Charlie, Percy, and the others. They keep these things hidden behind their jokes, using laughter to deflect from the vulnerability they are unwilling to expose. This pattern becomes more pronounced as the series progresses. Fred and George grow from mischievous children into young adults, and their humor evolves alongside them. While they continue to play pranks, their jokes become more pointed, more rebellious, and at times darker. Their decision to leave Hogwarts during their 7th year after their prank involving the skiving snack boxes marks a significant turning point. It is a bold move, an act of defiance against the authority of the school, and yet it is also a sign of their underlying discontent. They are not just rebelling against the rules, they are rebelling against the uncertainty of a world on the brink of war. By opening Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, Fred and George carve out a space for themselves where they can be in control, where their humor can flourish, and where they are no longer bound by the rigid structures of Hogwarts. But even as they take this bold step into adulthood, they are still hiding behind the mask of humor. Their shop becomes a sanctuary, a place where they can laugh and joke without the weight of the world pressing down on them. But underneath the surface, they are acutely aware of the dangers that loom in the distance. They know that the war is coming, that Voldemort's forces are gaining strength, and that the world as they know it is about to change forever. And yet, even in the face of this reality, they continue to wear their masks, hiding their fears behind their jokes. They continue to make light of things that are far from funny, as if their laughter can somehow stave off the darkness. It is only when the war comes to their doorstep that the cracks in their armor begin to show. The Battle of Hogwarts is the defining moment for Fred and George. It is here, amidst the chaos and the violence, that Fred's death becomes one of the most devastating losses of the entire series. His death, so sudden and senseless, is a painful reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change. And it is here, in the aftermath of Fred's death, that we see the full extent of George's pain. George's grief is almost impossible to bear witness to. He loses not just his twin, but his closest companion, the person with whom he shared every moment of his life. Fred and George had been inseparable, their identities intertwined in a way that made it impossible to imagine one without the other. Their humor, their pranks, and their business ventures were all shared endeavors. They had built their lives together, side by side, and now George was left to navigate a world without his twin. It is a painful, tragic irony that George, who had always used humor as a shield, now finds himself unable to hide behind it. For George, The loss of Fred is a loss of his own identity. Fred had been his constant, the one person who understood him completely. And now, with Fred gone, George is left to face a world that feels empty and hollow. His jokes fall flat, his laughter is hollow, and his smile is forced. He cannot seem to find the joy that had once come so easily to him. In the years following Fred's death, George struggles to reconcile the person he was with the person he must now become. His shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, becomes a place of both healing and sorrow. It is a reminder of the dreams he had shared with Fred, and it is also a reminder of what he has lost. The turning point comes when George finally begins to let go of the mask. It is a gradual process, but one that is marked by small moments of vulnerability. He begins to talk about Fred, to remember the good times, to grieve openly. His laughter returns, but it is not the same as before. It is tinged with sadness, with the understanding that life has changed irreparably. The mask is no longer necessary because George has finally come to terms with his loss. He is no longer hiding behind humour, he is confronting his grief, and in doing so, he begins to heal. Fred and George's story is a poignant reminder of how humour can be both a gift and a defence. It is a way to cope with the world, to hide the pain and the fear that we cannot otherwise express. But it is also a way to connect with others, to bring light into dark places. Fred and George's humour was never just about making others laugh, it was about surviving in a world that often seemed unfair and unforgiving. In the end, their story is a testament to the power of humour to both protect and heal, and to the strength it takes to let go of the mask and face the world as it truly is.